Good afternoon, everybody. We shall get the proceedings underway. When Barack Obama was first elected President of the United States, he was riding a swell of hope, however illusory that hope may have been, across the country, that our first black, or at least half-black president would usher in an era of post-racial harmony. Well, 7 years later, I think we all know how well that turned out. Obama has healed the racial divide about as successfully as his promised healing of the oceans. Racial unrest in this country has gone from a tense simmer to a raging boil. The left would like to pin the blame for this on what they claim is the right's racist refusal to accept a black man as president. In fact, what has exacerbated race relations in the United States is the inherent racism and grievance-mongering of the left's identity politics, spearheaded by Obama himself. Progressive racism, not the right, is the reason for today's heightened racial conflict. David Horowitz needs no real introduction from me to this crowd, so let me focus, if I may, on his new book instead, Progressive Racism, which I recently reviewed for Front Page Mag. Needless to say, I gave it 2 thumbs up. Progressive Racism is the 6th and the most recent volume of David Horowitz's collected conservative writings called The Black Book of the American Left. This book collects nearly 50 essays of David's thoughts on the politics of race over the last 20 years. The book, and not to give away the ending, but the book concludes that the racial bias which the left demands, quote, tears at the very fabric of the social order, compromises true equality, and is the antithesis of the American dream, unquote. And if I could quote a little bit more from it, in a free society composed of individuals who are unequal by nature, the highest government good is neutrality in the treatment of its citizens before the law. One standard and justice for all. This is the only equality that is not at odds with individual freedom. It is the only equality that can make a diverse community one. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founder of the Freedom Center, author of too many books to mention here, including Progressive Racism, one of the few intellectuals willing to talk honestly about race, and still the left's most hated adversary, David Horowitz.
Sorry for all those words, but somebody has to do it. President Obama has said that racism is in the DNA of America and transmitted through the generations. This is a malicious libel. It is, in fact, the most malicious libel ever uttered by an American president against his own country. Slavery existed in Africa for 1,000 years before a white person ever set foot there. Slavery existed in all societies for 3,000 years. Just was a common, it's what you did when you conquered your enemy. You enslaved the men and the women. From the beginning of time, no one ever said that slavery was immoral. Not Aristotle, not Moses, not Jesus, until white Christians in England, led by Wilberforce, did towards the end of the 18th century. And in the British colonies at the time, a white slave owner named Thomas Jefferson wrote into America's birth certificate that liberty is a God-given right that government can't take away, and equality too. Within just a little more than a generation, and at the cost of 350,000 Union lives, slavery was abolished in America and quickly then in the Western Hemisphere. Every black person alive in this country owes their freedom to America. That is the true DNA of America. It is liberty, not racism. The libel that it's racism has a second malicious effect, which is to persuade, unfortunately, large members of the black community that that is the truth. and to alienate them from this country and make them feel like outsiders. When black people are as American as any other group, they were on this continent from 1619. You can't speak of American culture without black culture. It doesn't exist. And one could go on and on. So this has a terrible effect on black people in this country and on the rest of us. It sometimes takes years to get a crucial fact like this right, and then it can be undone by the next generation of ignoramuses. People come into this world without any knowledge and experience, and it sometimes takes you a lifetime, and sometimes, like the president, you don't learn even over a lifetime. We had a saying in the 60s, you can't trust anyone over 30. That was just youthful arrogance that nobody should respect. The reality is you can't trust anyone under 30 because they just don't know enough. They haven't had a life experience. When I was a youngster, about 11 or 12, a book came into my progressive household. My parents, as you all know, were card-carrying communists. And the book was titled, "We Charge Genocide." And what it was, in fact, was a petition. The book was published by an organization calling itself the Civil Rights Congress. And it was a petition to the UN to condemn the United States for genocide against black people. In the frontispiece, there was a photograph. Could we have that photograph projected? Is there a projector that's going to put the photograph up? I guess Elizabeth. Anyway, this is a photograph. It is the most famous photograph of a lynching. Two black men hanging from trees, and a white man facing the camera and pointing at them. Everybody who's seen any picture of lynchings has seen this photograph, and hopefully we'll be able to get it up briefly. It was incredibly disturbing to me as an adolescent, and it's still disturbing enough that this hotel didn't want us to show it while the staff is present. So this hotel is a safe place and could join any university, could be a subsidiary of a university. But it is a horrifying photograph. It took me 10 or 20 years before I had read enough about, or read about lynchings to understand that lynching was not devised for black people. There is a racial dimension to lynching, and it's a terrible, evil one. But actually, lynching was just frontier justice. It was, let's not waste time with the due process. Let's, have the punishment before the trial, like Alice in Wonderland. First the punishment, then we can have the trial. I also learned that a third of all lynch victims were white. And that tells you a couple of things. First of all, that it wasn't devised and wasn't a practice just against black people, but also that they were lynched because they had allegedly committed crimes that were worthy of hanging. So most of the lynching cases are not a bunch of white racists grabbing a black person and stringing them up from a tree, but were hangings to punish people for crimes for which they had been accused. In this particular case, the two men hanging were named Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith. And there was a third. They had a companion named James Cameron, who was 16 at the time, who was not lynched, who was present. What had happened was, and I learned this 50 years later, listening, I just happened to tune in an NPR program where they interviewed James Cameron, who was then an old man, about what happened. And what happened was the three of them had been accused, arrested for murdering a young white factory worker and raping his girlfriend. And the lynch mob had broken into the jail and took them out and then strung the two up from the tree. That's the famous picture. That's Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith. And you can see the crowd is white. But they had been accused of murder. According to James Cameron, they actually had committed the murder. According to the white woman who was allegedly raped, she hadn't been raped. So the rape charge was spurious, which would have turned up in a trial. But the murder charge was right. Now, this doesn't make lynching right. Lynching is wrong, and it's evil. We have due process in this country for a reason. It's to protect the innocent. Another fact about this lynching is, why didn't they hang James Cameron, who was also black and who was arrested with them? And the reason was James Cameron said that he didn't participate. He didn't want to commit the murder. It was a robbery. Commit the murder. And he didn't participate. He stayed in the car. And he probably would have been hung for being black. There is a racial obvious dimension to lynching. Except that a white woman in the lynch mob stood up for him. And so they let him go. He was subsequently tried and convicted of being an accessory before the fact. And he served 7 or 8 years and then spent his life fighting for civil rights. And in 1991, the state of Indiana pardoned him. And you can find all this out on Wikipedia if you look up just Marion, Indiana lynching or Indiana lynching. This is the most famous lynch picture. It was a picture on which Abe Meeropol, an American communist, wrote the song Strange Fruit that Billie Holiday sang. And it's a symbol, and obviously was used in this book, We Charge Genocide, as a symbol of white racism. Although, obviously, once you know the facts, it's a lot more complicated than that. Another thing I learned years and years later, probably when I had become conservative, so it'd be 20 or 30 years later, was why this book, We Charge Genocide, and this petition was brought to the UN. It was, after all, it was brought to the UN, this is around 1950, 51, when America had been through the Second World War, and we had fought the master race. The Nazis were driven by a theory of the master race, and the conscience of America was awakened, and the barriers began being broken down. The military, in 1947, was integrated. Truman integrated the civil service. Jackie Robinson became the first black participant in America's national sport. It was only a couple of years before Brown v. Board of Education integrated the schools. So why, in the first place, the charge of genocide? That is a deliberate campaign to exterminate a people. What's going on with the Jews today and the Muslim world was obviously not the case. Well, the Civil Rights Congress, which authored the petition, was a Communist Party front, and therefore it was run from Moscow, as we also have learned through the opening of the Soviet archives. In Eastern Europe, there was a show trial taking place in Czechoslovakia, which the Kremlin was behind. The Kremlin had accused the top leaders of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party of being Trotskyites, Titoites, and Zionists. The Zionists was because 11 of the 13 leaders that they hung were Jews. In other words, the We Charge Genocide campaign was not about black people at all. It was about using black people as a battering ram against the United States to neutralize the bad publicity the Kremlin was getting for its campaign against the Jews, which then spread, as everybody knows, to the Soviet Union itself. A battering ram. This progressive tradition, my parents, who were communists, never referred to themselves as communists, always as progressives. This progressive tradition lives today in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party doesn't care about black people. It doesn't really do much for black people except throw them crumbs and bribe their leaders to keep the community in line. That's basically what goes on. The big perks go to the leaders. But the black masses, as we would have called them when I was a leftist, in our inner cities, they get crumbs. The Democratic Party controls every major inner city in America. 100%. 100%. And has for 50 to 100 years. Everything that's wrong with the inner cities in America, every oppression, every deprivation, Democrats and progressives are responsible for. The destroyed school systems that year in and year out don't teach these kids to read and write, massive failure works, non-graduation. The Democratic Party will go to the death to defend the teacher unions, which provide a slush fund for the party. I don't have to go on about this. I'll come back to it later, maybe. But using blacks as a battering ram, that's what progressives do. And that's why every election year, the Democratic Party will run on Republican. Donald Trump is a racist. Black churches will burn if the Republicans are elected, and so forth and so on. This is their bread and butter. It's disgusting and it's racist. I didn't, well, as I say, I learned late about these facts. It took a lifetime of, I've done nothing but politics, basically, since I was 10 years old. I understand that most people can't devote themselves so fully to political arguments and to investigating these things. And I'm sure the facts that I've laid out here are obscure or invisible to most of the people actually even watching C-SPAN, which are people who are probably highly politically educated and informed to begin with. I went on in the 60s. I raised a lot of money, as you know, probably. I've written about this extensively, for the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party was seen by the left as the vanguard of the Black Revolution. And I bought into that. And they were seen as a vanguard because they would take up arms against the police, stand up for the oppressed. Actually, prior to the 60s, in this period from the 1940 to 1960, the greatest social revolution in race relations ever in the history of mankind was taking place. In 1940, 4% of black Americans were in the middle class and professionals. In 1960, the figure was 49%. Just a remarkable transformation. And it was still only the beginning of the transformation that was taking place. But we on the left, we progressives, saw blacks as an oppressed people, and revolution was the only thing that would transform their lives. And therefore the left, which it likes to forget now, despised Martin Luther King. We supported him in 1963. But then, as things got more and more radical, the left despised Martin Luther King and turned its back on him. So he was a pretty isolated figure when he was assassinated in 1968. Anyway, I saw the Black Panther Party as blacks willing to stand up for themselves. It didn't occur to me that the Black Panther Party had no significant following in the black community of Oakland and the areas where they were prominent, that they were in fact feared by the local community. I had this progressive racism in me. I saw black people as symbols of everything that was wrong with America, and that's why I raised the money for the Black Panther Party and didn't pay attention to the signs. Well, in 1973, 1974, a woman I raised a lot of money to build a Black Panther school, and to buy a church and turn it into a Black Panther school. The woman I recruited to keep the books was a white woman named Betty Van Patter, who had 3 children, and who worked for me at Ramparts. I was editing then the largest magazine of the left. And in 1974, Betty disappeared, and by the time the police fished her body out of San Francisco Bay, I knew the Panthers had murdered her. And that was really the end of my career in the left, because all of my progressive friends defended the Panthers, and I knew that if I said what I thought, I would be denounced as a CIA agent and a racist. And I had a family with 4 children, and it took me some years. I fed this information to journalists, and one brave leftist named Kate Coleman published the first story about the Panthers. The Panthers were a street gang. They were criminals. They murdered 12 black people and got away with it. But this delusion, this progressive delusion, this melodrama of America having racism in its DNA, actually this delusion has metastasized if we come to the present. In 1999 or thereabouts, I was walking down a Berkeley street. I had spoken on 100 college campuses and saw what the students were being taught and fed, which was America was a racist country. And it occurred to me, well, and I was familiar with the curriculum. I was just struck by this thought that, it's politically correct to hate white people. And this became, and I determined right then, I'm going to write a book with the title, It's Politically Correct to Hate White People. I did write the book, which came out, I think, in 2000, or maybe 19, I don't remember the exact date. The publisher, first of all, when I told my New York publisher, I had one of the biggest, it was a division of Simon & Schuster, New York publishers, that I wanted to write a book called Hating White People is a Politically Correct Idea. My editor told me, we will never publish a book with that title. Of course, if it had been titled Hating Blackie, it would have been a bestseller. So I had to go to a little Texas publisher to get this book published. It was called Hating Whitey and Other Progressive Causes. In 2001, I became aware of a campaign on American campuses. It was called Reparations Awareness Week. It was a campaign to get reparations for slavery. This was 137 years after the fact. It would have been a reasonable campaign if, one, the reparations were to be paid by the Confederacy and not by the United States government, whose citizens lost 350,000 lives to end slavery, and spent, I don't know how much government spent, but obviously it was a lot of money. And it would also have been reasonable if there had been any slaves alive, or even children of slaves. Or if white America was opposed to any federal program that would actually help black people. So I conducted I took out ads, or attempted to, in college papers called 10 Reasons Why Reparations for Slavery is racist and bad for blacks. And why is it bad for blacks? For the same reason as the president's statement that racism is in the DNA of America, because it alienates them from their country. I mean, even the name African Americans, Africa is not a country, it's a continent. I don't know how many different languages are spoken and how many different nationalities they are. African Americans, for better or worse, are Americans. And they should be proud of it and take it as their heritage. And there are obviously some courageous blacks, like Sheriff Clark of Milwaukee, who do so, or Jason Riley of the Wall Street Journal, who do so. But they're considered race traitors by the progressives. Progressive is as big a misnomer as liberal. Liberals are bigots. They're intolerant. We all know that. They're not liberal about anything except hard drugs and sex and spending other people's money. That's what they're liberal about. They don't want two sides to a conversation. That's why I have to take bodyguards when I appear on campuses, and so does Ann Coulter and other conservative speakers. And why I don't have to go. I'm sure everybody is familiar with 100 atrocity cases that are committed by the totalitarians who run our universities, and particularly the totalitarian students who call themselves progressives. They're reactionaries. This is a throwback of 100 years, is what it is. And it's no accident that they support a totalitarian threat from Islam that we're now facing. So where are we today? Today we have a movement called Black Lives Matter, which is a roving lynch mob itself. By lynch mob, I don't mean string people up from trees, but I mean let's have the punishment before the trial. So they helped to burn the city of Ferguson, which is 60% black, punishing all the blacks who live there, with a demand for the head of a white policeman because he was white. No evidence, no trial. We want his head. That's what it was about. That is a lynch mob. That was supported by the President of the United States, who is a racist. If you don't think that a Barack Obama is a racist, then you tell me how his chief advisor on race relations, who's been to the White House more than anybody else, is the racist Al Sharpton, a convicted liar who ruined the lives of 6 people by spreading the lies of Tawana Brawley, and never paid the penalty, who owes the government $4.5 million in back taxes. Now, who could get away with that? He gets away with it because of what I call black skin privilege. If he were white, he would never get away with it. He'd never get away with being a racist and being near the President of the United States. Al Sharpton is a racial arsonist. He incited his own mob, the Action Network or whatever it's called, against a white, obviously also a Jew, store owner in Harlem some years ago, the owner of Freddy's Mart, and incited on his radio broadcast his followers to get the white interloper out of our community. Get the white interloper out. One of his followers torched the store, killed 7 people of color. And Al Sharpton is today the president's go-to person on race relations. This is what we've descended to. And it really started with Sharpton and Jackson, two race hustlers, two racist race hustlers, targeting white people. If you're white, you're guilty before the fact. You're guilty just by being white. And if you're black, you're innocent, even if the facts eventually show that you were guilty. Like O.J. Simpson. Black Lives Matter claims, and it's not just Black Lives Matter, but it's the entire so-called liberal progressive culture, which supports Black Lives Matter. Maybe you don't know this, but the Democratic Party officially endorses the Black Lives Matter movement. These are the people who have ruined the life of Darren Wilson, the officer who was defending his own life against a street thug named Michael Brown, who attacked him in his police car, reaching for his gun. Now, how many people out in the television audience would do something like that? That tells you everything you need to know about him. He wasn't picked on by Darren Wilson because he was black. He was picked on because he had just committed a strong-arm robbery. The lie, hands up, don't shoot, that Michael Brown was alleged to say was invented by his accomplice in the robbery. This is the civil rights hero of today. Or Freddie Gray, or Garner. Career predators. And who do they prey on? They prey on the black community. Black Lives Matter and many other people, we have university courses in this. And if you want to know where this problem comes from, it comes from turning the school system over to what I call neo-communists, people who thought, just like the community I grew up in, America's a racist country, it's an oppressive country, and anybody who goes to war with America has our sympathy. I remember clearly in the first Gulf War wondering if my ex-comrades on the left were going to support a monster like Saddam Hussein. And they did. And they did it again in 2002 and 2003. Anybody who hates America, they support. The hatred of America is so deep-seated among progressives and in the left that it's really hard for conservatives to fathom. Otherwise, there'd be many more conservatives talking the way I'm talking now. But I know it because I was there. White supremacy. America is a white supremacist nation. You hear that. Whoever says that is either a lunatic or a racist. Happens to be an anti-white racist, an anti-American racist, but a racist nonetheless. This is a country who's now at the end of 8 years of a disastrous presidency by Barack Obama. We've had 2 black secretaries of state, a black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 3 black heads of the National Security Council, including the current Susan Rice, who just made a racist statement that the NSC is too white, who's a liar, who's the one who went on television after Benghazi, lying about what happened, knowing it was a lie. We have thousands of black elected officials. We have major American cities like Atlanta run by blacks. Black mayor, black police chief, black superintendent of schools. And there are other cities just like that. Baltimore. And who suffers, by the way, by this progressive racism? Who suffers are black people in the inner cities. The assault on police, the war against police that Black Lives Matter and these other racists declared has led to epidemic homicides, spikes in the homicide rate and crime rates in cities like Baltimore and Ferguson. And who are the victims? Black people. It's time for black people to wake up and start voting for Republicans, or you're going to be in this prison. The blacks in the inner cities will be in prison. Let's not forget the thriving black middle class in America, and black upper class as well. It is so Orwellian and so diabolical that people put faith in the Democratic Party as the protector of blacks and the champion of blacks, when the Democratic Party is the worst enemy that black people have in this country, the worst. And let's not forget, the Democratic Party is also the party of slavery and the party of segregation. It is also the party of the inner city, the party of a welfare system that is destroying inner city black communities because it has huge incentives to kick fathers or men out of the household. So you have a single mother and then bribe the mother by giving her $200 a month or something like that if she has a baby. So you encourage large families, no wage earner, and if the mother also gets a job, if she earns some money, she loses her welfare benefits. How evil is that? And the Democrats are responsible for it, and Republicans are responsible because they're not screaming this from the rooftops every time they make a speech. Our national culture, the New York Times, the networks, PBS, the universities, encourage this kind of racism, anti-white racism and lunacy. I mean, you can't always tell what's going on. In this way, the winner of the National Book Award this year is America's most pampered racist, Ta-Nehisi Coates, son of a Black Panther, who didn't graduate from college, but was made a visiting professor at MIT nonetheless, was offered a column in the New York Times, was currently receiving a $650,000 Genius Award from the MacArthur Foundation, celebrated, praised by the Atlantic, by all liberal institutions, and written a racist screed. He got the book award for a racist screed called Between the World and Me, which is in the form of a letter to his son. Let me just quote one passage from it. "And so that beauty," writes Coates, "that Malcolm X pledged us to protect, black beauty, was never celebrated in movies, in television, or in the textbooks I'd seen as a child. Everyone of any import, from Jesus to George Washington, was white." Coates was born in 1975 and was 8 years old when Martin Luther King became the only American with a holiday in his honor. And in order to get that holiday, which was created by Ronald Reagan, George Washington had to be pushed to the back of the bus. So we have President's Day now, where Washington and Lincoln, the two formative figures in the creation of America, are bunched together with no name for the holiday. The first motion pictures championing civil rights and equal dignity for blacks, most notably Home of the Brave, began appearing in 1949. Sidney Poitier won the Academy Award as Best Actor for his role in Lilies of the Field, which was not about civil rights, it was about a wonderful black person, in 1964. In 1960, Harper Lee's novel about racial justice for blacks won the Pulitzer Prize and went on to sell over 60 million copies. In 1977, when Coates was 2 years old, television featured Roots, the epic miniseries about black oppression, which was the most widely viewed show of its time. Its episodes were viewed by more than 30 million Americans, and it won a score of Emmys. As is typical of the Black Lives Matter racists and Ta-Nehisi Coates and leftists like him in our academies, he simply lies to sustain his hatred of whites. In his book, he actually says his best friend was killed by a policeman. His best friend was black. The policeman said he was trying to run him over in his car. Tiny Easy Coates uses this as an example of America's white racism. However, the police officer was black. And he excuses this by saying the devil made him do it. He was thinking white. How racist is that? And this is a celebrated figure in a progressive culture. People are shaking their heads. Yeah, this is what our country has come to. This is why Donald Trump is such a compelling figure for so many Americans, because they're tired of this crap that's being thrown at them. They're tired of the lives that are lost because this racism is humored just because it comes from black people. How is it that civil rights heroes, so-called, are now career predators and prey on black people? How screwed up is that? What is wrong with with the progressive class? What's wrong is that our schools have been turned over to racists, anti-American racists, now for 20 and 30 years. The whole curriculums in our universities are devoted to teaching that it's politically correct to hate white people. You had the spectacle at the University of Missouri of empty charges. There were 4 charges that there was racism at the school. Not one of them examined. Think again, lynch mob. Not one examined. And mobs appeared demanding the resignation of the head of the whole Missouri university system, which they achieved in getting, over nothing, over empty charges. This was a school where the president of the student body was black, the vice president was black, and the leader of the lynch mob was a son of a multi-millionaire railroad executive. Black skin privilege. You can lie and people will believe you. It is time for America to return to its roots, which is individual rights, the individual circumstances, even of a lynching. You can see the bad dimensions of it. You can see the racial dimensions of it. But there are other dimensions as well. And those other dimensions should instill a certain sense of humility before you go screaming, Black Lives Matter. If Black Lives Mattered, you wouldn't be crippling the police, who are the only line of defense for people in the inner cities, because the Democratic Party in these Democratic-controlled cities and states had deprived them of their Second Amendment rights by stringent gun control laws, where the only protection they have is guns. Hillary Clinton has the Secret Service. The white middle class and people live in gated communities, they have security systems. But if you're a welfare mother living in a high crime area, the only security you have is what you can reach for in your night table drawer. And Democrats are determined, Hillary Clinton is determined to take, of course, that right away from all of us, but in particular from the black citizens of the Democrat-controlled plantation in our major cities. Return to individual rights. Return to what is so remarkable about this country. People say 400 years of slavery. There weren't 400 years of slavery in America. There were 400 years of slavery if you include the English colonies and the British Empire, which we defeated. America was created in 1776, or with the Constitution in 1787. And then within just a little over a generation, slavery was eliminated. America is the liberator of slaves, the liberator of black people. And until that is instilled again in our young people and in our culture at large, we are in a heap of trouble. Thank you.
We're going to take some questions because we're recorded on C-SPAN. Everyone needs, I would ask to line up at the microphone if you want to ask a question.
David, you mentioned Donald Trump twice. Some time ago, the Center mailed to me an interview with David Horowitz in which you were asked, many inside the GOP see him, that is Donald Trump, as a sign of a third worldish involution and unite unfit to be the Republican nominee. What is your opinion? Your answer was somewhat enigmatic. You mentioned Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson, a European tendency to look down their nose at Americans.
No.
Okay, now let me get to the final point. You said that one moral of Christianity is that saviors are crucified. So, were you suggesting that Donald Trump is a savior?
No. This was a comment about how people think. And Trump has excited conservative intellectuals, particularly grouped around National Review, because he hasn't read their books. That's what upsets them. And he probably won't read their books. And I was recalling how I learned, because of course I was brought up as an intellectual. I mean, ideas were really important to me. I read a lot of books. And when Kennedy was assassinated, I was in England. And the Europeans have always looked down on America. There are books starting from 1776. It's the children that, went astray. It's the product. We are the prodigal children of the Europeans. So they sneer at our culture. They sneer at, and particularly Texas, which is a very American frontier sort of state. And I remember when Kennedy was assassinated and LBJ became president, all my English friends, I was living in London, did they look down on him? He had LBJ dogs. He had LBJ daughters and wife. He had LBJ cufflinks. It was LBJ ties. This is, the American, what is he? He's everything that's wrong with America. Crude, rude, vulgar. I heard these comments about Trump. And that's but what happened next was this. Kennedy had all these reform programs. He couldn't get them through Congress. He didn't know how to do it. Johnson came in and, unfortunately for all of us, put through the Great Society in a couple of years. So I learned then that there's intellectual smarts, and then there's street smarts and political smarts. So to underestimate Trump, which is what every Republican on that platform did, and what a National Review and the Weekly Standard are doing today, is a huge mistake. That's all I meant by that. And when I brought up, I don't know why I brought up Jesus, but a rabbi actually taught me this, that people resent being rescued and saved. They resent that they're dependent on somebody else for their salvation, and they crucify them. I don't mean to compare Donald Trump to Jesus. It's just a human response. I also probably do too many interviews on the
What do you
radio.
think of Donald Trump?
Well, I think that Donald Trump, first of all, I think he's an incredible breath of fresh air in that he is not intimidated by what's called the political correctness, but which is actually a Communist Party line. That's what it is. And they keep you in check with that. So to be politically incorrect is to be driven from decent society. And you can see that reaction among these Republicans, conservatives like George Will, brilliant intellects, but they want Trump out of the picture. It's just too much for them. I think, like all presidents, he will disappoint us if he's elected. There are things that he can't possibly do. He can't reform the whole corrupt Washington culture. On the other hand, the confidence, such as it is, that I have in Trump, and it's not insignificant, is this. This is a man who takes his name and reputation very seriously. Trump Towers, Trump Airlines, Trump this, Trump that. When he gets to the White House, should he get to the White House, he is going to want to burnish that reputation, not to destroy it. He has made promises. He's going to build a wall. You better believe he's going to build a wall. Is that important for America? You bet it is. No country can exist, as he says. And as I have thought for many years before he said it, without borders. Not only that, we can't keep ourselves safe if we're letting terrorists and criminals. There are 550,000 illegal, convicted criminals in this country. 200,000 in jail and 350,000 roaming our streets and preying on innocent Americans. That is an outrage and a crime, and the Democratic Party is responsible for it. And all those Republicans who keep trying to appease the Democrats' wish for open borders so they can get votes. So I'm for Trump.
David, I, of course, agree with you that hands up, don't shoot was a farce, and conservatives should have immediately reacted to it and stayed on it. My question concerns some of the other black African-American police confrontations that you lumped into it, which I think, my question is, can't and shouldn't the conservative movement make teaching moments out of, for example, the following two? You mentioned Errol Gardner, but what we really had is a situation where he wasn't resisting arrest. He was talking calmly, and he was selling one cigarette. And let me just finish. And we have a liberal city with a liberal mayor passing wildly high taxes, and our cops, instead of dealing with genuinely violent crime, are becoming tax collectors for the liberal establishment. And the other example I would ask you about is we had the man who was shot in the back 6 times in, I believe, South Carolina, not resisting, and Phyllis Schlafly, who's certainly no liberal, wrote there that the teaching moment is that this guy was afraid of being put back in jail for not paying child support, and when we put people in jail for not paying child support, they can't pay child support. And again, it's a liberal policy.
The first teaching moment of that is that the officer who shot him in the back is on trial for murder.
Right.
That's the real lesson of that. The other stuff is interesting, but the real lesson is when cops commit crimes like that, they get tried and should be tried for it. The Garner case, look, this is a career criminal. I know the cigarette thing. You don't want to make an excuse for a guy who's been preying on black people for whatever it was, for 30 years. Also, he was resisting arrest. Also,
He was resisting arrest.
Excuse me.
It's very clear. He was speaking politely and talking. He took no physical effort.
When you excuse, I'm not going to argue with. I'm just going to tell you what my view. I'm just going to tell you what my view of this is. They tell you you assume the position when they're arresting you. You put your hands. If a police officer says to me, "You're under arrest," my hands are in my back. I'm a law-abiding citizen. The second thing is the officer in charge, the sergeant on the scene in charge of the arrest, is an African American.
I'm not dealing with race here.
Right.
I'm not going to a bunch of cops endorsing a liberal.
Just enough.
Okay, hi. You touched on the influence of unions on city government, and I applaud that. Now, there's an organization called the Industrial Areas Foundation, which was a Saul Alinsky startup in 1940, and there are a lot of branches of this. In Los Angeles, it's called One LA. They pretend to be motherhood and apple pie. However, on their website it says that they proposed to Cedillo, the head of the housing committee in LA City Hall, that he proposed a rent registration measure. And of course, that's being pushed through. Now, I'd like to ask you what you think of the influence of organizations such as that, which incidentally my temple belongs to, thank you very much, and to city government.
I wrote a pamphlet, I don't know if it's here, which 3 million people have read, called Barack Obama's Rules for Revolution. It's an analysis of Alinsky's Rules for Revolution, which is the original title. Saul Alinsky is a communist and an anti-American and a very dangerous influence. And so that's my view of those. Your temple should not be part of it. Shouldn't be
I agree, and I've been trying to say that. I was opposed to it, but I'm wondering what you know or what you think of this organization called 1LA.
I never heard of.
Okay, well, talk.
I know that Los Angeles is gone. All these cities are gone. I mean, they're 100% controlled by the Democratic Party. How could anything good be happening in them? And the unions. Well, it's one and the same.
1LA is under Discover the Networks. There is a
Yeah, we have an encyclopedia of the left, published, posted at discoverthenetworks.org. It's an encyclopedia, so I haven't read every entry.
Would you consider the cold reluctance of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement to repudiate the calls of their rank and file to kill police officers should designate that movement as a hate group?
It is a hate group. It is a hate group, and it's a typical leftist hate group. They hate the police. They are defenders of criminals at home and are enemies abroad. That's what progressives do. And of course, I'm not, in case there's people in the television audience, obviously not every Democrat, certainly not every Democrat voter, is aware of what they do because they're incredibly deceptive. When I was a young, when I was a boy, and Joseph Stalin, who had murdered 40 million Russians who didn't get on board for his socialist schemes, the one that Bernie Sanders seems to like, the slogan of the Communist Party was not a dictatorship of the proletariat in America, that's the Trotskyites. It was not calling for their slogan was not to call for a Soviet America. It was peace, jobs, and democracy. So people get fooled. The left is very seductive. People get fooled all the time. That's why social justice is a mirage. That's one of the big reasons why moral progress is a mirage, because people lie, and they're very good lies. Well, we've seen wonderful examples of it in the presidential primaries in both parties. Just a normal, I guess, human thing to do, to lie. And politicians have a vested interest in lying because they have to put together coalitions of very diverse communities who are normally at each other's throats. So they lie, they say one thing to this group and another to another, and every politician does it, which doesn't mean there aren't people of integrity in politics, but they're rare and rare. Okay.
Dave, you've talked about genocide, and you've talked about, or just mentioned, 40 million killed in Russia, and we could add 60 million killed in China. I hate it when somebody's killed unjustly, even one. Those kind of numbers I can't comprehend. Now, back in the 20s, Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, said that some words to the effect that we should not let the Africans work it out that our goal is to exterminate the African race. Wouldn't it help prove that America is not racist if Planned Parenthood was abolished and abortion was made illegal again?
I think Planned Parenthood should not get a dime from the federal government. Margaret Sanger was a racist, a eugenicist. She hated black people. The left can overlook that, can it? It can overlook what the communists did as well. I don't think there's anything that will prove that America isn't racist to people who, in their very being, in their very identity, hate America. And that's, to me, what the Black Lives Matter movement and the progressive left is about.
That there's roughly 1.2 million babies are aborted in America, and the vast majority are black. So it is a movement against the black people.
Yeah.
Therefore, it should be abolished.
But if you propose something sensible, like if you're receiving welfare and can't afford 10 children or 4, you should, as the price of welfare, until you get a job and start earning a living, have a Norplant, which is a kind of an implant that prevents you from having children. If you recommend that, then you're called a racist by the racists, the progressive racists. The book I've written is like 30 years of my wars against the progressive racists in our midst. And you can see that we've lost most of the battles. We got to start winning some.
Okay, this is the last question.
Last question. Well, trustfully, it's not last but not least, so we'll see what happens. First of all, thank you for coming. I appreciate you being here. I was in San Diego, and I tried to get down to see you, but that didn't work out. But I'm glad I'm here.
I know the students sort of preemptively
Yes. It was difficult
excluded
to get through.
anybody who didn't have a
But I
a
applaud
card.
your stand, and I'm a public school administrator, educator, and I appreciate your stand. My question directs itself to the idea of, under Ronald Reagan, I remember Bill Bennett was the Secretary of Education, and one of his first speeches, I loved what he said. He said, what we need to do in the Department of Education, again, he's the director of the Department of Education, and he said we need to eradicate the Department of Education. I applauded that so fully. It didn't happen, but that was his thought. Well, I'm forced to be a member of California Teachers Association, NEA, and I realize that NEA and AFT, American Federation of Teachers, are the largest contributing groups to the Democratic Party.
And socialist causes.
Right. So, and I realize you don't have a magic pill for an answer, but you're right, education got us here. And as Lincoln said, we're doomed to repeat that which we have. So what do you have for a thought in the sense of how do we steer this aircraft carrier?
I wrote 5 books on universities and how to reform them. Okay? And they just fell into a hole. Right? Republicans, when the Republicans control 30 states, I have spoken to chairmen of education committees, I have spoken to Republican leadership in various states. It's not a money issue for them, and it's a minefield, so they avoid it. I didn't get any real support out of the Republican Party. And until that happens, if conservatives continue wanting to cede our universities to the left, it's going to go on and on like that. They have to get prepared to actually fight. And I have to tell you, I can count on the fingers of one hand Republicans who fight. That has got to stop. Now, I have a friend who was a Democratic Party pollster and strategist who will remain anonymous because in his heart he's a conservative. And he explained to me how you get rid of the Department of Education. You increase its budget. You don't say we want to get rid of the Department of Education because people who are half listening or 10th listening, they hear you want to do away with education. So you don't ever say we want to eliminate the Department of Education. What you do is you increase its budget, and then in the fine print, you take away all its power and revert it. You make it just a pass-through, to the states or whatever. Or the best thing would be to convert its whole budget into voucherizing the entire educational system for everybody. That's what you need to do.
You are a light, seriously, and light dispels darkness, so thank you for being the light that you are. We just need to have more light, so
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I want to thank everybody, and I want to thank C-SPAN and Brian Lamb, because this is the only outlet I have that reaches people that are not in the conservative camp, because I have been blacklisted since I had the poor judgment to write an article for the Washington Post with my friend and co-author Peter Collier that we voted for Ronald Reagan.
Maybe you should call it whitelisted instead of blacklisted.
Well, you know, that's another funny thing, because the name black, I mean, I use the name black because Malcolm X said we need to call blacks not Negroes, as they were called, but blacks, because Negroes were Uncle Toms. And it was Jesse Jackson who insisted that it didn't change to African American. I use black because that's when I was, you know, cutting my political teeth. But actually, if blacks were called Negroes, we wouldn't have that problem, that black is a negative color. So is a self-inflicted wound, not by black people, but by people like Malcolm X, and Malcolm X in particular. And the African American is a misnomer also, but yeah, I call people what they want to be called. Thank you.
C-SPAN, created by America's